Everyone, this is going to be our first lecture. It's going to be going over Chapter 1 in the textbook. And I have broken this out into parts for the videos, so kind of a part 1 and then a second half. So this is going to go over really an intro to sport and exercise psych. So like I said, there's going to be 2 parts to the lecture for this chapter. In the beginning though, I want to do a instructor intro. I know I didn't really do that with the syllabus materials. But then we're going to get into a little bit of the meat of the chapter. In our second video, we'll really get into the scientific method and then a bit of the history of sport and exercise psychology. So let's jump into our beginning here. So I wanted to give you guys just kind of a quick intro. I know I just kind of threw my name out there in our previous video. Again, my name's Jordan Blazo. I'm a 4th year doc student. I'm originally from Michigan. If you guys are familiar with Heartland, that's crazy because it's a pretty small town, but it's basically about 45 minutes away from East Lansing. Really small town. And so you can see me here, and these are my two dogs. This is Foxy and then Frankie. You'll probably hear me using them as examples throughout some of our lectures, or you might just hear them barking in the background as I make these videos. But then also, just to give you guys a little bit of context about me, being a 4th year doc student, I'm pretty heavily involved in some research, and my personal interest is actually sibling dynamics in sport, which is a little bit different. I like to look at how sport and sibling relationships really can interact, and how having an older brother, younger sister, whatever it might be, might influence your experience in sport. So a quick roadmap to how I got here. I'm actually already an MSU alum. A while back I got my BS in psychology with a specialization in coaching, so I actually was in the kin department a good bit. Following that degree, I went down to Georgia Southern, which is about 40 minutes inland of Savannah. So that was quite an experience, and my degree there was in applied sports psychology, which we're actually going to talk a little bit about in this chapter. After my master's, I actually got the opportunity to go to Purdue University and start my work on my PhD. But my advisor, if you guys are familiar here with the kin department, we've recently gotten a new department chair, and that's my advisor. So I was 2 years into my PhD at Purdue, and he was lucky enough to be offered a job here at MSU, and eventually asked me to come with him. So I came up to MSU. It wasn't a hard sell. I've been here before, and now I'm back here in East Lansing, but still pursuing sports psychology. So that's a little bit about me. If you guys have questions about maybe the different experiences I've had or the different schools I've been to, shoot me an email. I'd love to talk to you about it. But that's enough about me. Let's jump into the lecture. So what we're going to cover today really is we're going to talk about some topics such as what is sport and exercise psychology. The book talks about, there are 2 primary objectives of sport and exercise psychology. Well, what are they? Who is sport and exercise psychology really for? Who are our clients? Who are the people that are interested in doing this work? And probably the most important one is this last bullet. What do sport and exercise psychology specialists do? We're going to talk about that a little bit. So what is sport and exercise psychology? Well, it's the scientific study of people and their behaviors in sport and exercise activities and the practical applications of that knowledge. So really it's got a lot to do with behavior and the mind and what's going on maybe internally for individuals or even groups of people, so teams. So usually we say that there are 2 primary objectives of sport and exercise psychology. The first one is this field of study is really trying to understand the effect that psychological factors have on physical or motor performance. So you can kind of think of this as, what effect the mind has on physical activity, whether that be organized sport, the production of movement, whatever it might be. Now the other objective is just kind of the other process of this. So it's really understanding the effect that maybe being in physical activity might have on on our psychological well-being or our development. So that's why I kind of made this figure at the bottom where you can see, yeah, maybe we study or we're interested in how the mind is going to influence physical activity behaviors, but we should also be interested in understanding how physical activity is actually going to influence our mind, our psychological well-being, development, all of these other factors. So it's really a cyclical relationship here where it's not just one direction, but it's actually it's bidirectional and reciprocal. So if we think about objective one, so this is where the mind might influence physical activity, here are some example questions that maybe someone who's interested in sports psychology is going to ask or is going to study. So how does anxiety affect a basketball player's accuracy and free throw shooting? Does lacking self-confidence influence a child's ability to learn to swim? How does a coach's reinforcement and punishment influence a team's cohesion? And does imagery training facilitate the recovery process in injured athletes? Now let's take a look at the other example here. So this is where physical activity might be influencing maybe some psychological factors. So does running reduce anxiety or depression? Do young athletes learn to be overly aggressive from participation in youth sports? And does participation in daily physical education classes improve a child's self-esteem? So you can see how these are really both objectives. They're really getting at two very different aspects of really just sport or physical activity involvement. Now the role of the sport and exercise psychologist or consultant, practitioner, whatever they want to call themselves, is threefold. There's one area that's very interested in research, and what these individuals are looking at is, can we advance our knowledge or what we know about the connection between physical activity and the mind, or the mind and physical activity. But then also the research group likes to be professional and scientific in how they move forward, and they're going to present this material in the form of conferences or journal articles, those kind of venues. The next one would be teaching. And I think you guys are probably fairly familiar with this, but it's really just the opportunity or where sports psychologists may teach at a university. It might be housed within a psychology department, or it might actually be within an exercise and sports science department, such as kinesiology, like we have here at MSU. But a lot of times you'll find sports psychology or sports psychologists who are interested in teaching going into some different departments, such as child and family development. They might go into straight psych. It might be clinical psychology. There's a lot of different avenues that you can take sport and exercise psychology. Now the last one is consulting. This is the real hands-on group. So these individuals are interested in working with athletes. And when I say athletes, I mean everybody across the board, all different ages, all different skill levels. But really, it's an art that these folks are doing, because they're taking the actual research, all of the very empirical or hard science stuff, and trying to go out and implement it and integrate it with teams or individuals to really help them perform better, and if not to help them perform better, to simply have a better sport experience. Now there are generally two sport psychology specialties, so it's clinical sports psychologists, and then there's educational sports psychologists or specialists. The clinical sports psychologists, they're really trained in psychology. They are psychologists. They generally have to go through licensure. They're trained to work with people with severe emotional disorders, so we can think of people who suffer from severe depression, maybe mood swings, eating disorders, these kind of topics. But specifically, these individuals are trained to help athletes with problems like this. So again, eating disorders tends to come up, but also substance abuse. These elements that really an educational specialist is not really prepared for or trained to do. An educational sports psychology specialist kind of takes this mental coach approach. So they're looking to understand the psychology of human movement. This is actually probably the realm that I would fall under. We have training in physical education, kinesiology, exercise, all of these sports sciences, but we're not really trained, or we don't have licensure to deal with severe emotional disorders. So our goal really is to educate or increase a coach, athlete, sometimes the parents, families, spectators, that kind of thing. Really get them involved and aware of some issues that really we've been trained in and have information about. So how to have your child deal with anxiety or deal with choking, or how we could implement a program in practice to boost confidence or mental toughness, these core elements that we usually like to see in sport. Now this is figure 1.2. It's just really trying to lay out the idea that sport and exercise psychology really is a blending of a lot of fields. So often a sports psych specialist is exposed to a lot of science or sports science knowledge domains. So we're talking ex-phys, biomechanics, motor development, motor learning, pedagogy, all of these different elements. But then we also are really well versed in the psychology component, and that can take on a lot of different forms like listed here. So that's where abnormal psych will come in, clinical psych, counseling psych, developmental psych, really a lot of different areas. But what a sports psychology professional will do is really their goal is to blend these two. So that's the end of part 1. When you're ready, go ahead and move on to part 2 of chapter 1.